Thank you. So my presentation is titled NASA During the Space Race, Art, Artists, and Anecdotes. So I'll be talking about the artwork at NASA, as well as some of the artists involved, and anecdotes about the astronauts that were helping with the art, as well as using the art in their missions. And you've probably seen some of my presentations. Typically, I do the technology side. This side's more on the human side of NASA and the space program. So I want to take a very different angle as far as looking at the space race. And I'll be covering basically the space race. I'm not going to do the shuttle. I'm going to touch on it in a little bit, but I think there's so much stuff for the space race that the shuttle missions would be a whole nother presentation I could do if anybody's interested, maybe next year sometime. And the space race basically was in the 60s, and it involved us and the Soviet Union racing to place a human being on the moon. And at times the race was close, and this is a Time magazine cover from 1968 showing an American cosmonaut in the tan-colored flight suit and a Soviet cosmonaut in the silver suit with a star, both trying to reach the moon as a goal, and it really was a race. And the first part of the race was what was called the Mercury program. This was America's first flight of a person going into Earth orbit and also suborbital. This is the symbol of the Mercury program. It's the planet Mercury symbol with a 7 in the middle. And this is actually a sculpture at the Kennedy Space Center. And the 7 was because originally 7 astronauts were picked for the Mercury missions. And the Mercury spacecraft was a very simple spacecraft, couldn't do very much, couldn't maneuver, couldn't change orbit, but it could get an astronaut into space. And the capsule was so small that the astronauts said that you don't enter a Mercury capsule, you wear a Mercury capsule. We had 6 missions, 2 were suborbital and 4 went into orbit. And we're all familiar with mission patches. This is Commander Borman on Apollo 8. You can see there's a mission patch above his left shoulder. However, a lot of people think the mission patches began with the first American space flights. They did not. If you ever see a mission patch from the Mercury era, it's actually a commemorative patch made years after the fact. When the Mercury program began, all the astronauts were military test pilots. And the first art that was involved on the capsules was basically a military grade stencil of the mission name. So this is the first mission that Alan Shepard flew. It lasted 15 minutes. He didn't go into orbit. And the capsule was called Freedom 7 because, of course, we're competing with the communist Soviet Union. So first American space capsule was called Freedom 7. And the 7 again was to reflect the 7 first astronauts that were involved in this program. And Alan Shepard was a bit of a prankster. He did land on the moon a decade later, and he actually smuggled a golf club onto the moon and shot a couple golf balls at the end of that spacewalk. So I'll be talking about that in a little bit. And if anybody's interested after the presentation, I've got a story about how much of a really evil prankster he was. And moving along, the second mission was called Liberty Bell 7. That was Gus Grissom, again suborbital, didn't go into orbit. So NASA decided to take one step further, and again, the military grade stencil Liberty Bell 7, but they put a crack on the capsule as if it was the Liberty Bell. And Gus Grissom actually had an incident during the splashdown when he returned to Earth. He had a misfiring on his hatch that blew the hatch out using explosive bolts in case of emergency, and the capsule sank. So that kind of hung over Gus during his career, that he basically lost the second American space capsule into the Atlantic Ocean. It was recovered in the 90s by, I believe it was Jeff Bezos, and is now in a museum. Uh, Next hero was John Glenn, who was the first American to orbit. And a lot of the astronauts were pilots. And I'll just say that sometimes pilots lived a very colorful life, and I'll leave it at that. But John Glenn was a very straight-laced kind of guy. He had a wife, kids. He was a Marine. He tried to start a Boy Scout club when he was a young man during the Depression. And he was a no-nonsense, honest guy. And he wanted to enhance the artwork on his capsule. So he hired a woman named Cece Bibby, who was an artist with one of the NASA contractors, that was the Chrysler Corporation. And he said to Cece he wanted artwork painted on his capsule. And she had to go up to the launch tower to paint this logo of Friendship 7 on the capsule. The issue was that this again was an all boys club. No women were allowed at the top of the launch tower. And the boss told John Glenn, I'm sorry, she's not going up there. And John Glenn basically chewed him out, saying, no, Cece's my artist. You're going to let her go up to the top of the launch tower and paint my logo. And she did. So yeah, he was definitely honest and didn't care about people's opinions or feelings about women, which was great. So that's the Friendship 7 logo that Cece painted on the space capsule. And one thing that happened is Cece was a bit of a prankster. They would use a periscope on the capsule for navigation. So she put a picture of a scantily clad woman on the periscope for John. Considering that this is kind of a family event, I'm not going to show the picture, but John was offended and he told Cece that that was not cool. So Cece decided to get him back again the next time he looked through the periscope during a training or a exercise on a launch pad, and she put this logo into his periscope. So that did give a good laugh with John Glenn. You were expecting somebody else, John Baby, and it shows a woman who's doing custodial services for NASA. And if you go to the USS Hornet Museum in Alameda, there's actually a signed replica of the Friendship 7 logo in their museum. It's small scale, it's not full scale, but it's actually signed by CC Bibby. I know the curators there, and actually they couldn't tell me where this came from, so I need to find this out. But again, it shows Cece's artwork. She also did illustrations for magazines and whatnot. And if you want to look at a biography of somebody involved in the space race, again on the more art and humanist side, definitely look into Cece Bibby. She also did two more missions for the Mercury program. She did Aurora 7, and I think a lovely piece of art there showing Aurora, and also Sigma 7 for Wally Schirra. And Sigma is the sum symbol in mathematics, so it was the summation of the 7 astronauts that were involved in the Mercury program. On the last mission, she had to go to California, so she didn't do the last logo, but a McDonnell engineer named B.R. Schuster did the Faith 7, which was Gordon Cooper's flight, which was the last Mercury flight, and the last solo flight of an American astronaut into space. The next program was Project Gemini. And as astronomers, we of course know Gemini is the twins in space, and Project Gemini was used to try to figure out man and machine in Earth orbit before we went to the moon. So they were testing all the systems, operations, etc., in low Earth orbit before risking a lunar mission. And the Gemini symbol for the program would use the symbol for the astronomical constellation, had 2 stars for each astronaut involved. And when they would talk about the astronauts during the program, they would call the astronauts Castor and Pollux. And the Gemini program was a little crazy because we were trying to beat the Soviets in less than a decade to land on the moon. So instead of building a dedicated rocket, they took a nuclear ICBM, took off the warhead, and put the space capsule on top. And it was a very wild ride. Basically, as the rocket burned fuel, it became lighter. And because the thrust was constant, you had much more acceleration, going up to 7 Gs, which is crazy for a normal person. You pass out at 9 Gs if you're a pilot. So these pilots had to train for the massive G load because they were flying on a nuclear missile or a missile intended to drop nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union. It was never initially built to carry human beings. And one of the artists at NASA was named George Mathis, and he did conceptual drawings of what the Gemini mission would look like. So here is a painting that he did of the Gemini rocket staging on its way to low Earth orbit. And he also did concept art for NASA. So NASA would hire Mathis to do this kind of stuff. I used to work at Aerojet here in Sacramento, and because Aerojet supplied some of the engines for the Apollo program, and I worked with some of the guys that worked on that, which was a great thing to be mentored by. His paintings were hanging in the conference rooms at Aerojet, and it was a real treat to go into a conference room for a meeting and look around and see paintings of Gemini concepts or Apollo concepts done by George Mathis. These were originals. And I don't know what happened to them because they shut down the plant, but hopefully these were preserved. So here's another concept of George Mathis showing the Gemini capsule and the second stage after detaching. Now, another person I want to talk about is astronaut John Young. Now, pranksters, being a prankster is common among astronauts. It's actually more common than people would believe. And John Young was one of America's greatest astronauts. He flew 6 missions, went to the moon twice, walking once, and even did the maiden flight of the space shuttle and commanded a second space shuttle flight. And if you notice, he has what looks like a mission patch on his right shoulder. That is still not an official mission patch. That's for the first Gemini mission, which was Gemini 3, and he was the pilot on that. And this is basically a coin for that mission. And again, as I mentioned, he flew other missions, including another Gemini flight, 2 Apollo flights, and 2 shuttle flights. And I want to talk about his first Gemini mission. The person he flew with was Gus Grissom. And Gus Grissom, as you remember, lost a capsule in the ocean. So they nicknamed this mission Molly Brown, after the unsinkable Molly Brown from the Titanic. So that was kind of a joke about nope, Gus, who was commanding the mission, is not going to lose this capsule. And they were only up in space for about almost 5 hours. And thankfully, they did not sink that capsule this time. So Gus Grissom kind of helped fix his reputation. And as far as being a prankster, John Young decided to smuggle a corned beef sandwich onto that mission. NASA was not happy about that because back then they would measure everything the astronaut ingested and everything that came out of the astronaut because they wanted to study, human biology in space. So this corned beef sandwich really irked the doctors because it messed up their medical testing. And pilots hate doctors because doctors can ground a pilot. So I'm sure that John and the fellow astronauts got a good laugh at how mad they got the doctors because anytime a pilot pisses off a doctor, he's happy. And that being said, the restaurant in Cocoa Beach called Wolfie's that provided the corned beef sandwich capitalized on that. So they would talk about their space menu, and one of our corned beef sandwiches actually went into space around the Earth. Thank you, John Young. And if you're in the Grissom Memorial Museum in Mitchell, Indiana, you have this beautiful sculpture of a corned beef sandwich from Wolfie's. So you can actually see a replica of the corned beef sandwich that John Young took up into space. And of course, Gus Grissom turned a blind eye during the mission. He knew John was doing it and kind of chuckled about it too. And of course, uh, the thing that was really nuts about this incident is it actually made the congressional record. Congress was asking questions about this incident. Why are we paying you, millions of dollars when one of your astronauts smuggles up a corned beef sandwich into space? And again, yeah, John Young got chewed out a bit, but he was a very successful astronaut, regardless of smuggling corned beef sandwiches to space. We're getting closer to mission patches. This is the second manned Gemini flight, which is Gemini 4. Geminis 1 and 2 they had no crew for testing. And this is James McDivitt doing a spacewalk, the first American spacewalk. And if you notice, he's got an American flag on his left shoulder. These guys were military men, and there's a tradition where flight suits have their patch, the flag patch on the left shoulder. However, most military uniforms have it on the right shoulder. So it's interesting that there are exceptions to military and astronauts in that they wear the patch on their left shoulder. So now we're getting to our first mission patches, which was Gemini 5. And the 2 astronauts, Cooper and Gordon, decided to have a mission patch. So they designed the Gemini 5 mission patch with a Calistoga wagon. This was a long duration flight. It was almost 8 days. And imagine being cooped up in that capsule with no running water, uh, no space, no change of clothes, with your best buddy next door for over a week. But nevertheless, the mission was to try to figure out long duration, and they had issues that almost caused them to come back. NASA was not happy about the patch having 8 days or bust. So they told them that you can only fly if you take that 8 days or bust or cover it up on your mission patch. And sure enough, they had a successful 8-day mission. These are the astronauts on board an aircraft carrier. And if you zoom in, you can see their patch is missing the 8 days or bust. So if you ever want to buy this mission patch, if you're a purist, if you're a stitch counter, you need to get the version without 8 days or bust because that's actually the one that flew. But they usually sell this version which has the 8 days or bust on it. So beginning with Gemini 5, of course, every single crewed American space flight mission has had a mission patch. And I won't go into all the details in the Gemini program, but these are the remaining Gemini missions that I won't go into details over. But as you can tell, there's a lot of creativity that came into these. The astronauts would either sketch these, draw them, or give an idea to a NASA artist, and then they would create the patch. And over time, the procedure developed where NASA could reject or accept the patch or give comments as far as what changes need to be made. And one of my favorites is the last Gemini mission, Gemini 12, which was the last mission for the program, and then Apollo was going to be next. So there's an echo of a crescent moon here, meaning that this will be the next step in our space program. And that mission actually flew during a solar eclipse. So they actually did see a partial solar eclipse during that mission, and that also echoes in this patch. So the next program was the Apollo program, of course, and that's where we landed on the moon 6 times. And just to go briefly over it, it was launched by a giant Saturn V rocket. There was a 3-person crew, and it carried usually 2 spacecraft going to the moon, a command and service module, which would carry all 3 astronauts, and then a lunar module, which was only used to land on the moon with 2 astronauts. When they got to the moon, this spacecraft would be docked to the lunar module. 2 astronauts would go to the lunar module. 1 guy would stay in lunar orbit. These 2 guys would land, do their astronaut business, and then fly back to lunar orbit, redock, and then re-enter the command and service module. They would dump this, and the 3 astronauts would fly home in the command and service module. And this is kind of important, and I'll talk about art in a little bit here. So in 1962, to their credit, James Webb, who was the NASA administrator and the NASA Space Telescope namesake, commissioned artists and decided to start a NASA art program of commissioning artists to do paintings, portraits, sketches, etc. of the space program. And they had regular artists as well as very famous artists, including Norman Rockwell, hired for this effort. And Norman Rockwell summed up Americana during the 20th century with his artwork. I love his artwork. So he wanted to capture what the whole space program was all about. We always look at the 3 astronauts, for example, in Apollo that went to the moon. But what we sometimes forget is there were over 400,000 people involved in making that happen. Everything from a mom and pop operation that designed some little widget to send to the rocket, or to gigantic corporations like Aerojet or Lockheed Martin or North American Aviation that built a lot of the big hardware for this. And this painting by Norman Rockwell kind of sums up the people behind the 3 men who wound up going to the moon, and to acknowledge their effort involved in that, and acknowledge it as an American effort, as part of, again, Americana. He also tried to do concept art as far as what would happen when we did eventually land. So this first steps painting was done 2 years before Apollo 11. And he went into a lot of really good detail as far as trying to capture, the rays from the engine, some of the scorching that was here below. And this painting is really neat because if you look at the top of the painting, you see some detail, including the command and service module in lunar orbit around the lunar module. You can see the crescent-shaped Earth here with Earth with shine here from the moon, and you can also see an astronaut poking out of the top hatch of the lunar module, taking a reading or taking a photograph of some sort. Although this never happened simultaneously with the moonwalk, there was this type of EVA done on Apollo 15 to survey the land before they went out and did moonwalks. So he really did an excellent job of trying to capture not only the spirit of of the moon landing, and I love how the astronauts boldly stepping off the pad, but also a lot of the technical aspects, even though he obviously wasn't an engineer or a scientist. And here's a great picture or painting that I hope to see when I get over to the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., showing again John Young, Mr. Corned Beef, and Gus Grissom, the unsinkable Molly Brown, suiting up for their Gemini flight. And when I go there, I'll look closely to see if there's a corned beef sandwich because he stuffed it into his leg pocket here on his spacesuit. But this artwork is hanging in the Air and Space Museum, and definitely I need to go see it. Now, to their credit, NASA not only hired classical artists like Norman Rockwell to capture the space program, they also hired Andy Warhol. And I didn't know this until I began writing this presentation that Andy Warhol was on the payroll of NASA to do art. And for the people that don't know who he is, Andy Warhol was a mid-century modern artist who did some really different art. So this is kind of his style here, where he's trying to capture the launch of a Saturn V, trying to capture the Florida environment with, the crane, the palm trees, as well as some of the technical aspects. If you look at this composite, you can see oops, dang it, there's engineering schematic showing the rocket, as well as, a crew or a technician working on it, and other aspects. And he also did kind of interesting art. This is called the Moonwalk Suite by taking photographs of an Apollo moonwalker and adding some color to it, some unique neon shades and whatnot. And I suspect that the MTV logo that came about 10 years after this was trying to copy this motif a bit too. Now, going back to mission patches, what I really like about mission patches is sometimes there's a lot of subtle detail that doesn't necessarily jump out at first blush. This is the Apollo 8 mission patch, which was the first mission to orbit the moon. They didn't land on the moon, but they orbited it. And if you study Apollo, they had what was called a free return trajectory. When they launched out of Kennedy and they went towards the moon, they would basically do this figure-8 pattern. They would fly to the moon's gravity would capture them. They'd go around the back, and if they did nothing, the gravitational forces would kick them back in this figure-8 pattern and bring them back to Earth. This is called a free return trajectory that actually Apollo 13 used to come home as safely as possible. And by coincidence, it was also the Apollo 8 mission. So they used the number 8 in this clever way of tying it to the free return. Now, if you want to stay at the moon, when they do this leg of the journey, they do a rocket firing on the backside of the moon, and that puts them into a circular orbit. And then they fire the rocket engine again when they want to go home, and they'll come back on this figure-8 pattern. The Apollo 8 mission orbited the moon 10 times, and it was the first time human beings actually went around the moon. And it was also a test flight of all the systems before the landing attempt. And this mission actually returned one of the most iconic photographs of the Apollo era, and that was moonrise, excuse me, Earthrise from the moon. This photograph has been used by the environmental movement to try to clean up the Earth. And it brought attention to the fact that we live on a very fragile planet. So this was actually widely seen back in the late 60s. And I'm old enough to remember the 70s, and yes, we have problems with pollution and whatnot, but compared to what it was in the 70s, things are a lot better. And I think a lot of that had to do with awareness brought up by these beautiful artistic photographs that were taken by the NASA crews when they went to the moon. And also, this is the same mission where they were orbiting the moon on Christmas Eve, 1968, and they read from Genesis, where they read basically the first chapter of Genesis during an international broadcast. And the idea was that reading from the Old Testament would try to reach out to as many people as possible and also try to unite the Earth during Christmas Eve as well as being around the moon. And NASA basically told them, do something appropriate on Christmas Eve. They gave him no boundaries. And the crew, all three of them, read a piece of Genesis chapter 1. So it was kind of a ad hoc type of activity on Christmas Eve. And I know there are people probably old enough here that probably remember that broadcast on Christmas Eve 1968. I was too young. I was basically born, that year. But now the next mission was Apollo 9, where they tested the lander and the module in Earth orbit before they went to the moon. And one of the issues was that you suddenly have two spacecraft with the same mission name in Earth orbit. We only had two spacecraft flying at one time with the Gemini program, but they were Gemini 6 and 7, and it was easy to say over the radio when you're talking with them for mission control, Gemini 6, Gemini 7. So the crew had to invent call signs for each spacecraft. And you'd think that they'd pick something, historic or whatnot, but here were their call sign names. The command and service module was called Gumdrop, and the astronauts chose that. And I'll explain why Gumdrop in a moment. And the lunar module was called Spider, which is kind of an obvious choice because the lunar module kind of looks like a spider. But I was always curious why they picked Gumdrop. And the reason was when they were prepping the capsule, it was covered in this blue protective film. And to the astronauts, it looked like a gumdrop. So that name stuck. So they began a tradition of having call signs for each spacecraft during a lunar mission where they were doing a landing. The next mission was Apollo 10, and this was kind of important for art, and I'll explain in a second. The first one was it has a really cool mission patch. Two of the astronauts, Stafford and Cernan, flew on a Gemini 9 mission. And when you compare the two patches, you can see echoes of the Gemini 9 patch, which was a previous mission, on the Apollo 10 patch with the big Roman numeral, and also kind of showing a schematic of the spacecraft to some degree. And interestingly enough, Tom Stafford did not walk on the moon, but Gene Cernan did in a later mission. And also John Young, Mr. Corned Beef, was on this mission too, and he did subsequently walk on the moon. So this was an interesting mission as far as the artwork, as well as the next point, which I'm going to bring up, are the call signs. So the call sign on the command and service module was Charlie Brown, and the call sign on the lander was Snoopy. And the reason they picked Snoopy is during the mission, they would do everything regarding a landing except touchdown. They flew within about 40 or 50,000 feet of the lunar surface, and then the lunar module flew back to the command and service module. And they picked Snoopy because the lunar module was snooping around. They were taking photographs of Apollo 11's landing site, and they were trying to get more data as to what it would be like to be close to the surface of the moon. So the name was picked for that reason. And Charles Schulz, who did the Peanuts cartoon, loved it. He was a huge fan of the space program. And this is they totally embrace Snoopy as their icon. And this is the crew of Apollo 10 going to the launch tower, and there's a woman who's a worker at NASA holding onto a giant stuffed Snoopy, who was the Apollo 10 mascot. So going back to Charles Schulz has supported NASA through the space race until his death, and he would do regular artwork for NASA. And also they named an award called the Silver Snoopy Award, which was given to people who would do exceptional work for mission success at NASA. And one of my friends from Michigan actually earned this award, he's a former deputy administrator at NASA. So this little beagle that Charles Schulz drew did become an astronaut. And I'll explain that too. But Snoopy is a huge hit with NASA. If you work in the aerospace industry, you frequently see posters talking about, your mission and success. And the left-hand poster, basically, the Apollo program was a very quickly run program with very tight schedules. And the motto here is Apollo will be judged by results, not intentions. So don't tell me about how you're going to land on the moon. Show me how you're going to land on the moon. And one of the big problems we have in aerospace is what's called FOD, foreign object debris. So, a grain of sand can destroy a rocket engine, and that's not an exaggeration. So FOD protection is critical, and you would see posters like this, dirt and fibers are for the birds, keep space hardware clean. And of course, there's our mascot, Snoopy, pointing a finger, report that man to contamination control because they take FOD that seriously. If you do a major FOB mistake or ignore FOD protocol, you can actually be fired because again, a speck of dust can take down a rocket engine. And as an engineer, I love this because this is actually a engineering graphic. This is not, an artistic rendering for the public. This is an engineering graphic talking about communication networks for NASA. So you have all the communication bands between the command and service module, the lander, which is Snoopy in this case, and ground control in Houston on Earth. So this is a great way to get a good chuckle when you're reading some really dry engineering documents. And I love the fact that they do this. And going back to our trusty Beagle being an astronaut, a recent tradition in space flight is to bring a zero gravity indicator, and that zero gravity indicator is always a stuffed animal. On the Dragon flights, they actually take a stuffed dragon. This is a photograph from Artemis 1. The Artemis rockets will be returning to the moon, beginning with a crew beginning next April, where we're going to do a 4 astronaut orbit, not a landing yet. And for Artemis 1, which was an unmanned mission that flew to the moon and back, did not land, they brought Snoopy as their zero-G indicator. And here's Snoopy floating in the Artemis 1 capsule with his pressure suit and happy as a clam to be actually a true astronaut. So going back to Apollo, Apollo 11 was the first landing attempt. And that's the iconic patch that was, done for the mission. And of course, we all know the crew members, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin who walked, and Michael Collins who stayed in lunar orbit aboard the command and service module. And of course, by this time, NASA insisted on a very dignified name for the spacecraft. So the command module was Columbia, and the lunar module was Eagle. Now, Michael Collins was an artist, and he was somebody who was rather on the humble side. And he said, I'm not that great of an artist, but he did watercolors, and I think he was a pretty good artist. So these are some of the watercolors that Michael Collins drew, and you can purchase these. They're not cheap, but they are available for purchase. So he tended to draw nature stuff. You have a koi pond there, you have a bird on the shore, and he lived, I believe he was in Florida for a while, so he definitely tried to echo some of the natural scenery that he saw as a Florida resident. He was also an avid fisherman, and he tended to also do some silly art of a fish taking off from a launch pad. Okay, kind of odd, but what the heck. And also some of the scenes of rainforest areas in Florida. And what's interesting is Michael Collins actually designed the iconic mission patch of an Eagle landing. He did a sketch. I cannot find a sketch. I looked all over for it of the original patch. I had my daughter, who's an amateur artist, render it based on how he described it. So this is, again, not an original Collins, but my daughter's rendering of how he did it. His first idea was to have the eagle landing with its talons outstretched to land on the moon. And he said, I wanted it to look like something out of a National Geographic photograph. And also to place a olive branch in the eagle's beak. So this was the first rendering that he did showing the eagle coming in for a landing. He's a pilot, of course. You need your landing gear extended. And as a peaceful gesture, have the olive branch. NASA did not like it. NASA said, you cannot do this. NASA said, the talons look too aggressive. I think it's just wrong to have an aggressive eagle. And he's like, but it's not aggressive. It's just putting on his landing gear. So the compromise, of course, was to have the olive branch move to the talons and have the eagle landing with the talons. And Michael Collins, of course, agreed. Okay, I get it. But he wrote in his book that every time he saw this patch, he's wondering, when's the eagle going to drop that olive branch and extend their landing gear to land? And I think it's one of the most iconic patches from the space program. And Michael Collins was also a graffiti artist. Because if you look inside the Columbia capsule, he actually wrote this in the capsule after splashdown. And it said, Spacecraft 107, alias Apollo 11, alias Columbia, the best ship to come down the line. God bless her, Michael Collins, CMP, Command Module Pilot. And of course, the Smithsonian loves this because they're preserving this because the capsule right now is in the Smithsonian. So the next mission was Apollo 12, and there is a tragic side of this mission which is actually reflected in the patch. As I said, these mission patches have a lot of detail in them that may not be obvious. The command module was called Yankee Clipper. So of course there's a classic American sail ship there. And the crew was Gordon. The crew that actually flew was Pete Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean. And there are 3 stars reflecting the crew in the patch. However, if you notice, there's a 4th star. The original lunar module pilot was an astronaut named Clifton Williams. And every pilot at that time would get a T-38 trainer jet aircraft to be able to keep their flight hours up and fly between, meetings or whatnot across the country. Clifton unfortunately died when he had a mechanical failure in his T-38 and crashed. So Alan Bean replaced him as the lunar module pilot. And in honor of Clifton, they added a 4th star to the mission patch, which is really, really cool to honor the memory of a fallen astronaut. And this tradition did continue, unfortunately. And one case was the Challenger missions. This is where I'll touch on the shuttle a little bit. Of course, we know we lost the Challenger, the 7-member Challenger crew in 1986. On the return to flight mission, if you look at the logo, you can see there's a Big Dipper. And there's 7 stars in the Big Dipper, and that was to honor the loss of the Challenger crew 2 years previous to the flight that returned the shuttle fleet to operational status. And several of the shuttle patches afterwards did have those 7 stars honoring Challenger. And sadly, we had to do this tradition again because in 2003 we lost the Columbia crew, and 7 brave astronauts perished on reentry during that flight. The return to flight of the shuttle a couple of years later, STS-114, honor their memory by having a silhouette. Oh, sorry, dang it! By having a silhouette of the Columbia space shuttle there, as well as 7 stars to reflect the crew that we lost in the tragic reentry of STS-107. Going back to artists, Alan Bean, who flew on Apollo 12 and walked on the moon, was also an artist. And I never met this gentleman, but apparently he was extremely friendly and loved doing art. And he would do paintings of Apollo missions and also what it was like to be an astronaut. And if you notice on the left-hand side of the astronaut doing an EVA, there's prints of moon boots. Alan Bean brought back his moon boots that he walked on the moon with. And he said, those moon boots have pieces of moon dust in them. Every painting he made, he would stomp them with his moon boots because it would leave some microscopic residual of moon dust. So if you have an original Alan Bean painting, you have moon dust in it. Granted, it's probably microscopic, but you definitely have moon dust. And he would try to capture images of, the machinery doing its job, astronauts doing their work on the moon. And again, another artist to look at. His paintings are beautiful. And unfortunately, Alan Bean has passed away, but he left quite a prolific catalog of space paintings. And going back to mission patches, they're not all serious. Well, there is a funny side to them too. Again, going back to pranksters, Alan Shepard walked on the moon with Apollo 14. And this was the mission patch for Apollo 14, and it shows basically the symbol for the astronaut corps flying to the moon. Now, and this again was the crew. Oh, sorry, that's the backup crew. Every mission has a backup crew, and the backup crew will take over either a single astronaut or the whole crew if something happens to the primary crew. They train with the astronauts, they help the astronauts, they do a lot of work for the astronauts, but never fly in space for that mission. So, of course, it's kind of an unsung job. Now, traditionally, they would always fly 3 missions later, and in this case, Gene Cernan and Ron Evans flew on Apollo 17. But this crew decided to make a mock patch, and this is the backup crew's patch. And it shows the Coyote and Roadrunner, of course, in their usual chase scene. The Roadrunner, being the first team, made it to the moon. And if you look at the Coyote, he's unshaven and he's got bloodshot eyes, kind of showing that he's been working really, really hard. But he didn't get any of the glory because, of course, the Roadrunner got to the moon and the Coyote never did. So it's kind of cool how they echo that. And mock patches continue to this. Oh, before I talk about mock patches, this is the golf club that uh, Alan Shepard took to the moon. At the end of his EVA, he actually had two golf balls smuggled in a sock and knocked two golf balls a good distance on the lunar surface. He was the first astronaut, American astronaut in space. He was the also a moonwalker, and he was retiring after this. So NASA couldn't really do much about it, even though he broke protocol by smuggling a golf club to the moon. And the golf club is now at the U.S. Golf Association's museum in New Jersey, and you can go see that golf club that actually was the first golf club to hit a drive on the moon. And there's a video of it. You can actually see the video of him trying. He failed the first time, completely missed a golf ball because the pressure suit was very tight, but he did whack a couple of drives. And the silly patches did continue into the shuttle era. So the 13th shuttle mission, this is the crew. It actually didn't wind up being the 13th mission because they did kind of move missions around. But their mission patch, of course, was a beautiful patch showing a reflective view of an astronaut's helmet. And they have all their proper last names on the patch. However, being their 13th mission, they decided to make a mock patch. And of course, it being, you know, bad luck to be 13, you have a black cat with a 13 on it. You have a space shuttle flying underneath the cat as if it's a ladder. Of course, bad luck again. And you have their nicknames, Crip, Dick, TJ, Ox, and Pinky. So glad to see that astronauts have a sense of humor, especially considering the long hours and difficult work they do. And it's probably one way to stay sane with the long hours and difficult work. Going back to the moon landings, this one I think is neat because sometimes there are really subtle details that are hidden that are not obvious initially. Apollo 15 was the first mission with a rover. It was also a mission with three Michigan aerospace alumni, Go Blue, and they landed in a mountainous region of the moon, and the mission patch actually reflects the mountainous region. Now, if you look closely on the right-hand side of the patch, you can see a Roman numeral 15. And that was a little detail that the artist hid in the terrain that's on the background of the patch. So you can see the XV or the 15 for the mission designation. And they also did something really neat, which I thought was a very beautiful gesture. They actually left a sculpture on the moon. This is the fallen astronaut sculpture. It's actually a very small sculpture. It's only about 3 or 4 inches in length. Again, weight is everything in space travel. And this sculpture was honoring all of the fallen astronauts, both on the American and the Soviet side, including the Apollo 1 crew that passed away in a fire, as well as the Soyuz 1 mission, which ended in the death of their cosmonaut, as well as both astronauts and cosmonauts who died in training accidents. So it was a very nice gesture of the Apollo 15 crew to leave this sculpture on the moon, and it's the first memorial on the moon that's been placed by human beings. So I'm going to wrap up the Apollo program here. Here are the mission patches, and again, I think these are beautiful works of art. There are stories behind every patch. I won't go into details because I could spend hours talking about this, but something to take a look at. And again, these are all the missions that either went into Earth orbit for practice with Apollo hardware or actually landed on the moon. Uh, the next missions were what was called Skylab, where we launched a space station to the moon. And these are the three mission patches for Skylabs 1, 2, and 3. Each of those missions carried 3 astronauts that spent several weeks in Earth orbit aboard the Skylab space station. We had a total of 24 weeks accumulated time between the 3 missions. And I just want to show a few things about the artwork here. If you look at the Skylab 2 mission, that mission had studied human biology in space as well as the sun and the earth. So I love how they set up, a half sun and a half earth. They were taking actually really groundbreaking photographs using space telescopes of the solar surface. And also, Da Vinci's painting there showing the, anatomical part of the biological part of studying. And one thing I like is how sometimes the artwork can bring about, shows the period it was written in. The third mission, which was number 3, uses 3 circles here. And if you look closely, you can see the number 3 here in the patch as well. And I like how it's got that early 70s kind of a vibe to it, as my kids would say. So I think that's a really cool aspect of it too, where again they were studying, Earth's nature, uh, physics, and again human biology and long-term exposure in Earth orbit and in space. And one of the neatest missions, in my opinion, was the Apollo-Soyuz mission, which was the last flight using Apollo hardware. And that involved a peaceful mission with the Soviet Union. We launched three astronauts aboard an Apollo spacecraft. The Soviets launched two cosmonauts in a Soyuz spacecraft, and they docked in low Earth orbit. And the left patch is the mission patch. The right logo is the program logo. And during this mission, there was a big argument about, is one side going to be more superior than the other? So they were very conscientious of that when they designed a logo. And if you look at this logo, both spacecraft are even, and there's kind of almost like a yin yang tie-in here where you have Apollo in blue on one side and Soyuz in red on the other. And if you were to flip this patch 180 degrees, you would still have that even orientation. So there's actually a lot of politics involved in that in that program logo that was designed there. But there was a humorous side. This is a Snoopy art, of course, and this was done by Charles Schultz, and it shows Snoopy on the American side saying "Right on," and I love that 70s slang there, in 1975, "Right on," and you've got the Russian bear there, and what he is saying in Russian is "Let's go." So this was a nice little friendly patch for both sides, again bringing our astronaut Snoopy aboard for this one. So this again was the mission. You had the Apollo spacecraft, you had the Soyuz spacecraft, and this was the crew. There were three Americans and two Soviets. And this painting depicts the mission. And this was actually drawn by the commander of the Soyuz spacecraft, which was Alexei Leonov. And Alexei was also an accomplished artist. So this is one of his paintings prior to the mission going up. And you can tell that it's actually in the early stages because the hardware isn't exactly what they flew eventually. And that kind of dates it as being in the early planning stages. And that's cool too, because you get to see how the program evolved and Alexei's incredible talent. And there's Alexei on the bottom with Deke Slayton, who's an American, meeting up during that mission in space. So I want to talk a little bit about Alexei Leonov. Uh, my colleague that I know from Michigan actually knew him personally, said he was a very friendly guy. He would hug everybody he met. He loved to hug you. And he was a great ambassador between the Soviets, Russians, and the Americans to, try to make peace in the space program. And if you look here, he's holding on actually to what looks like a sketch of Tom Stafford, who's the American commander on the Apollo side. And here is Alexei in his art studio. One of the things he did after he did his first mission, he did two missions. He flew a Voskhod mission for the Soviets, and he did a spacewalk. He was the first person to do a spacewalk on that Voskhod mission in the early 60s. And there is Alexei in his art studio. And Alexei would always carry an art kit when he went to space on his two missions. So he would carry these pencils to draw on, and that's kind of what he would do in his spare time. And one thing is, you know, there's that joke talking about how America spent millions of dollars to make a space pen, whereas the Russians took pencils aboard. Well, remember about FOD? Pencils are a really bad idea in zero gravity for two reasons. Number one, because it's a combustible product. You do not want to fire in space. And number two, if the lead breaks off, that can conduct electricity and get stuck in a circuit or a switch. So the Soviets and Russians eventually did adopt a pen, but in the early space program, they did in fact use a pencil, including Alexei, who took up his pencil sketch kit on the Voskhod mission back in the early 60s. And this was the sketch that he drew uh, of sunrise from low Earth orbit. And he described how he could see all of the different colors and all of the different gradations of Earth's atmosphere being lit up by the sun at sunrise. And it's a sight that must have just been spectacular to see. And Alexei uh, did drawings from his experience as an astronaut and or, excuse me, cosmonaut. And these are drawings that he did of him doing his spacewalk, which I've mentioned this in my previous talk about the Soviet space program. If you ever want to study a mission, study the Voskhod 2 mission with Alexei Leonov, because that EVA almost killed him because that pressure suit was not working right. It was too stiff for him to come back into the capsule, and he had to release the air to the point where the spacesuit had almost no pressure to be able to squeeze into his capsule. The second thing that happened is they landed 200 miles off course in a remote Russian forest. It took 2 days for them to be found and rescued. They were hunkered down in a cold forest with wolves circling their spacecraft because they had no support, nobody out there. And when they finally got to them, they couldn't land a helicopter near them, so they had a Russian military ski patrol go out there with skis to give to Alexei and his comrade in the flight. I'm sorry, his name escapes me, and they had to ski out to the helicopter to finally get out. Wild mission. It's a great aspect of space history that I would recommend anybody study if you're into this stuff. And one interesting aspect about Apollo-Soyuz is you have a language barrier. So what they said was, okay, American crew, you have to speak Russian. Soviet crew, you have to speak English. And that way they had to learn each other's language to better communicate. So any type of operations in space, they had to speak the other person's language. And Tom Stafford, this gentleman here, was the commander, and he was from Oklahoma, and he had kind of a thick Oklahoma drawl. So Alexei Leonov said, there were not two languages spoken on mission. There were three languages: English, Russian, and Oklahomsky. And that was actually a very affectionate thing to say because uh, Tom and Stafford became very good friends. And Tom also had some ribbing for the Russians. He said, we had some fun with Alexei and Valerie, the other cosmonaut, joking about whether or not we would be able to make a true Russian toast in space with real alcohol. Sure enough, as Deke and I were eating, the cosmonauts handed each of us a tube labeled vodka. And I'm from Eastern Europe, and toasting with vodka is always done during a really neat event. So if you're having a great get together, you're celebrating something, you got to do a vodka toast. To our great disappointment, both tubes actually contained borscht, Russian soup. And borscht is good, but it's not vodka. So here's a photograph of them having, their little vodka salute. So that's Tom Stafford on the left and Deke Slayton, two of the American astronauts with the Russian borscht tubes. Judging by their expressions, I'll let everyone be the judge if it was borscht or vodka. And again, pilots be pilots, so who knows? Who knows if they're telling the truth or not about it being vodka or soup? But I'll leave it up to everybody to look at the photograph and decide that fact. And going back to the fact of Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov, they became lifelong friends. They would be godparents to each other's kids. Uh, Unfortunately, Alexei, I can't remember who passed away first. I believe it was Tom. Alexei passed away first, so Tom went to his funeral. They helped each other out. It was a great friendship, and I think it was one of the best things that came out of the Apollo-Soyuz mission back in 1975 at the depths of the Cold War. So to wrap it up, you know, uh, I am a photographer. I do art photography as an amateur, and I also love, again, as I mentioned, the artistic aspect of the photos that came back, including this famous Earthrise by Bill Anders on Apollo 8. And as mentioned, one of the things that the art photography did, as all art should do, is reflect ourselves. We Art should be edifying. Art should help us understand the perspective of another person or understand what might be a shortcoming in life or celebrate what's good in life. And I think a lot of the NASA art does that. And I think the photographs that we brought back of our own Earth do that too. Uh, many of the astronauts that actually saw Earth from space said it was a very moving experience and changed their lives as being able to have that perspective of covering up the Earth with your thumb in the sky and you're covering up every single person that's ever lived or is living and everything that happened on our planet. Uh, Michael Collins, who was the command module pilot on Apollo 11, said, I really believe that if political leaders of the world could see their planet from a distance of, let's say, 100,000 miles, their outlook would be fundamentally changed. The all important border would be invisible, that noisy argument suddenly silenced. And likewise, David Scott, who was a moonwalker on Apollo 15, said, It truly is an oasis, and we don't take very good care of it. And I think the elevation of that awareness is a real contribution to, saving the earth, if you will. And I think that is one of the great impacts of the artwork from the space race, as well as, again, seeing the human side of the astronauts, of the people that made the program possible, and of everybody else involved in this monumental effort for our country. So that is all I have, and I will be happy to answer questions. This is a photograph of Cece Bibby. She used to basically go to conventions and whatnot and show off her artwork. So she was definitely an accomplished artist. Unfortunately, she passed away about a decade ago. But I'll happily answer any questions. I'm an engineer, I'm not an artist, so I may just say I don't know to your answer, so forgive me for that. So I'll turn it back over to the club. Thank you.